If you're an Australian parent, there's a good chance you're buying foods that are advertised as healthy for kids, foods promoted as better choices, foods marketed as safe for lunchboxes, foods you trust because they're made for children. But what if some of the healthy kids' foods Australian parents buy every single week are quietly affecting their child's health in ways no label ever explains? What if the problem isn't what you're doing, but what you're being told to trust? In this video, I'm going to show you 7 healthy kids' foods Australian parents must avoid, and once you understand why, you'll realize how easy it is to put your child at risk, even when you're trying to do everything right. Most Australian parents believe they're making safe, responsible choices when it comes to their children's food, especially when those foods are advertised as healthy, designed for kids, and approved for school lunchboxes. But what many parents don't realize is that a large number of these products fall into a category nutrition scientists now call ultra-processed foods. Over the past decade, research has shown that frequent exposure to ultra-processed foods during childhood can affect blood sugar regulation, gut health, appetite control, and even behavior, not immediately, but gradually. And this is where the problem becomes difficult to spot. These foods aren't sold as junk. They're sold as healthy kids' foods in Australian supermarkets. That's why today we're taking a closer look at healthy kids' foods Australian parents must avoid, not based on fear or opinion, but on ingredient lists, processing methods, and what current nutrition science actually tells us. As we go through this list, you'll start to notice a clear pattern, one that explains why many parents feel like they're doing everything right, yet still see unexplained issues with their child's energy, appetite, or focus. And by the time we reach item number 7, you'll understand why this issue is far more common than most Australian parents realize. Before we get into the list, let me say this. If you're a parent watching this, you're here because you care about your child's health. If this kind of investigation matters to you, if you want to understand what's really being sold in Australian supermarkets, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. We don't do panic. We don't do trends. We look at labels, ingredients, and facts, so parents can make informed choices. Now let's start with number 7. Number 7 is one of the most common kids' foods in Australian households: fruit pouches. Fruit pouches like Rafferty's Garden Apple and Pear are marketed as one of the safest choices parents can make. They're labeled as 100% fruit, no added sugar, and are clearly designed for children's lunchboxes. To most parents, this feels very close to giving fresh fruit, just more convenient. But once we look at the ingredient list and the nutrition panel, the story becomes more complex. What the label actually shows. The ingredient list is short and simple: apple puree, pear puree, and vitamin C. There are no artificial colors, no preservatives, and no added sugar listed, which is exactly why parents trust it. However, nutrition isn't only about ingredients, it's also about form and processing. When fruit is turned into a smooth puree and sealed into a pouch, the physical structure of the fruit is broken down. That structure, especially intact fiber, plays a critical role in slowing sugar absorption in the body. In this form, the sugars found naturally in fruit become what nutrition science refers to as free sugars. They're still coming from fruit, but the body absorbs them much faster. Now look at the nutrition panel. A single pouch can contain the sugar equivalent of several pieces of fruit, delivered in seconds without chewing, and without the normal signals that help a child feel full. From a physiological point of view, this matters. Free sugars are absorbed rapidly, leading to quicker rises in blood glucose followed by drops. For children, this often shows up as hunger soon after eating, fluctuations in energy, or irritability without an obvious cause. This is why many parents notice something subtle but confusing. Their child eats a fruit pouch, and not long after they're asking for another snack. Not because fruit is bad, and not because parents made a poor choice, but because foods advertised as healthy for kids don't always behave the same way in the body as their whole food versions. Another important detail parents are rarely told is how quickly these products are consumed. Whole fruit requires chewing. Chewing slows eating, activates satiety hormones, and supports appetite regulation. Squeezing a pouch bypasses all of that. From a developmental perspective, regularly consuming calories in this form trains a child's body to expect sweetness without effort and energy without fullness. Nutrition researchers have been raising this concern for years, particularly around liquid and pureed fruit products for children. Parents who want to verify this can look at how health guidelines differentiate between whole fruit and fruit juices or purees. The same principle applies here. This is why fruit pouches like Rafferty's Garden Apple and Pear belong on the list of healthy kids' foods Australian parents must avoid as everyday staples. Not because they should never be eaten, and not because parents are wrong to trust the label, but because the way these foods are processed changes how they affect a child's appetite, energy, and blood sugar in ways the packaging never explains. And as we move on to the next item, you'll start to see this same pattern repeat itself, even in foods that look completely different from fruit. Children don't process food the same way adults do. Their metabolic systems are still developing. Their appetite regulation is still being shaped. And their bodies respond much more strongly to how food is structured, not just what's written on the label. One of the most important concepts in modern nutrition science is this: satiety comes from structure, not from calories. Foods that require chewing, digestion, and time in the stomach send strong signals to the brain that say, "I'm full." Foods that are soft, liquid, or highly processed don't. This is why two foods with the same calorie content can affect a child completely differently. When a child eats a whole apple, their body has to work. Chewing activates satiety hormones. Fiber slows sugar absorption. Fullness builds gradually. But when that same apple is blended, squeezed, or processed into a ready-to-eat product, those signals are weakened or lost. Nutrition researchers call this food matrix disruption, when the natural structure of food is altered in a way that changes how the body responds to it. This matters even more in children. During childhood, the body is learning what normal hunger and fullness feel like. Repeated exposure to foods that deliver energy quickly but don't satisfy hunger properly can confuse that system over time. Parents often see the result without knowing the cause. Constant snacking, hunger shortly after meals, strong preferences for sweet foods, energy swings during the day. This doesn't mean parents are doing something wrong. It means the environment has changed, and the foods marketed to kids today behave very differently from whole foods, even when they look healthy. Health organizations around the world consistently emphasize the same principle. Prioritizing foods that are minimally processed, require chewing, and support natural appetite regulation, especially during childhood. Parents who want to verify this can look at how dietary guidelines distinguish between whole foods and processed alternatives. The message is always the same. The more intact the food, the better the body understands it. And this is exactly why the next item on our list is so important. Because it looks nourishing, it's trusted by parents, and yet it quietly breaks this rule. Let's continue with number 6. Number 6 is a product many Australian parents buy believing they're supporting their child's growth and gut health: kids' yogurt drinks. Yogurt has long been associated with strong bones, calcium, and digestion. So when a product like Yoplait Yop Mini is marketed specifically for kids, most parents see it as a responsible, nutritious choice. It's easy to drink, easy to pack, and clearly designed for lunchboxes. But once we look closely at the ingredient list and the nutrition panel, a different picture begins to emerge. What the label actually shows. The ingredient list starts with milk, which sounds reassuring. But very quickly, sugar appears, along with flavorings and stabilizers. When we look at the nutrition panel, one detail stands out. In a single serve, the amount of sugar is higher than the amount of protein. That balance matters. Protein slows digestion, supports satiety, and helps keep blood sugar stable. Sugar does the opposite. So even though this product is sold as yogurt, the body often processes it more like a sweetened dairy drink. Form is another critical factor here. This yogurt isn't eaten with a spoon. It's drunk. From a physiological perspective, liquids and semi-liquid foods pass through the stomach much faster than solid foods. That leads to quicker glucose absorption and a weaker fullness response. This is why many parents notice something confusing. Their child drinks a yogurt like this, and not long after they're hungry again. It doesn't feel logical because yogurt is supposed to be filling. But the combination of sugar, low protein, and liquid form changes how this food behaves in the body. There's also a common misconception around gut health. Traditional unsweetened yogurt can support beneficial gut bacteria, but when sugar levels are high, especially with frequent consumption, that benefit can be reduced or even reversed. Nutrition research has consistently shown that high sugar intake can negatively affect gut balance in children over time, particularly when these foods are consumed daily under the assumption that they're healthy. Another important point is frequency. Because products like Yoplait Yop Mini are marketed as healthy kids' foods, they're often given every day, sometimes even more than once a day. That repeated exposure trains a child's body to expect sweetness without sustained nourishment. Not immediately, but gradually. This is why yogurt drinks like this belong on the list of healthy kids' foods Australian parents must avoid as everyday staples. Not because yogurt is bad, and not because parents are being careless, but because the nutritional balance and liquid form of these products don't match the role parents believe they're playing in a child's diet. And as we move to the next item, you'll notice this same imbalance appear again, in foods that don't even look like drinks. Before we move on, there's another piece of the puzzle parents are rarely told about: how sugar-heavy foods affect a child's hormones, not just their teeth. When children eat foods high in rapidly absorbed sugars, their bodies respond by releasing insulin. That's normal, but children's insulin responses are more sensitive than adults. Their systems are still learning how to regulate blood sugar efficiently. When sugary or highly processed foods are consumed frequently, even foods advertised as healthy, this creates repeated spikes and drops in blood glucose throughout the day. And those drops matter. Low blood sugar doesn't just trigger hunger, it affects mood, focus, and emotional regulation. This is why parents often describe the same patterns: sudden irritability, difficulty concentrating, strong cravings shortly after eating, emotional swings that seem to come out of nowhere. These aren't personality traits, they're physiological responses. Another hormone involved here is cortisol, the stress hormone. When blood sugar drops quickly, the body releases cortisol to compensate. In children, that stress response can look like restlessness, agitation, or hyperactivity. What makes this especially confusing for parents is timing. The food is eaten, everything seems fine, and then, an hour later, behavior shifts. This delay makes it very hard to connect cause and effect. Modern nutrition research has been clear on this point. Stable energy comes from meals and snacks that combine protein, fiber, and slower digesting carbohydrates. Foods that lack this balance, even if they're fortified or marketed for kids, tend to destabilize energy rather than support it. This is exactly why breakfast plays such a critical role. The first meal of the day sets the hormonal and metabolic tone for everything that follows. And that brings us to the next item: because few foods influence a child's daily energy, focus, and appetite as strongly as what they eat in the morning. Let's move on to number 5. Number 5 is a food many Australian parents grew up with: kids' breakfast cereal. Breakfast cereals like Kellogg's Cocoa Pops are often seen as a normal, even reassuring way to start the day. They're familiar, quick, and heavily marketed to children with messages about energy, fun, and added vitamins. To many parents, that feels like a reasonable breakfast choice, especially on busy mornings. But when we slow down and look carefully at the ingredient list and the nutrition panel, a very different picture begins to form. What the label actually shows. On the ingredient list, the first thing you see is refined grain, in this case rice, followed very closely by sugar. Cocoa appears in a much smaller proportion, along with salt, flavorings, and added vitamins and minerals. Now look at the nutrition panel. Per standard serving, the cereal provides a high amount of sugars, very little protein, and minimal fiber. That combination is important. Protein and fiber are what slow digestion, support fullness, and help regulate blood sugar. When they're low and sugar is high, the body absorbs energy very quickly. From a physiological point of view, this means one thing: a rapid rise in blood glucose, followed by a drop not long after. This is why many parents describe the same experience. Their child eats breakfast, and within an hour, they're hungry again, restless, or struggling to focus. This isn't a behavior problem. And it isn't because breakfast is unnecessary, it's because the type of breakfast matters. Another detail that often reassures parents is fortification. Boxes like Cocoa Pops highlight added vitamins and minerals, which can sound like nutritional insurance. But fortification doesn't change how the food is metabolized. Adding vitamins to a high-sugar, low-fiber cereal doesn't make it behave like a balanced meal. It still acts like a fast-digesting carbohydrate once it's eaten. Nutrition science has been consistent on this point. Children benefit most from breakfasts that provide stable energy, meals that combine protein, fiber, and slower digesting carbohydrates. Highly processed breakfast cereals marketed for kids do the opposite. And because breakfast is eaten every day, this effect isn't occasional. It's cumulative. That's why cereals like Kellogg's Cocoa Pops belong on the list of healthy kids' foods Australian parents must avoid as a daily breakfast staple. Not because children can never eat them, and not because parents are making irresponsible choices, but because when a food repeatedly causes energy spikes and crashes, it quietly affects appetite, focus, and eating patterns over time. And as we move on, you'll see that this same issue appears again. This time in foods parents often rely on for school snacks. Before we move on, there's one mistake almost every parent makes, and it has nothing to do with a single food. Most parents don't build their child's diet around one bad choice. They build it around patterns. A sweet breakfast, a processed snack mid-morning, another snack in the afternoon. Each choice on its own seems harmless. But the child's body doesn't experience them separately. It experiences them as a continuous metabolic signal. Every time a child eats a food high in rapidly absorbed carbohydrates, blood sugar rises, and every time it falls, the body asks for more. Over time, this creates a rhythm. Hunger isn't driven by real energy needs anymore. It's driven by blood sugar recovery. This is why many children feel hungry every 2 hours, even when their calorie intake is adequate. Nutrition research has shown that frequent exposure to fast-digesting foods trains the appetite toward grazing rather than satiety. Children stop recognizing what true fullness feels like. And here's the part parents rarely hear. The body adapts. When this pattern becomes normal, foods that once felt satisfying no longer do. Portions increase, cravings become more intense, and snacks quietly replace real meals. This isn't about willpower, it's biology. And this is where snack foods play a powerful role. Because snacks are often eaten between meals, they either support satiety or they reset hunger prematurely. That's why the type of snack matters far more than the idea of a snack itself. And it's also why the next item on our list is so important, because it's marketed as a healthy snack, trusted by parents, and yet designed in a way that reinforces this exact pattern. Let's move on to number 4. Number 4 is one of the most common lunchbox foods in Australia. Snack bars marketed as a healthy choice for kids. Snack bars like Uncle Toby's chewy choc chip muesli bars are often seen as the perfect middle ground. not junk food, not a treat. Just a balanced snack parents feel comfortable packing for school. They're marketed with words like whole grain, energy, and made for lunchboxes. For many families, they've become a daily habit. But once we examine the ingredient list and nutrition panel, that sense of balance starts to fall apart. What the label actually shows. Looking at the ingredient list, you'll notice multiple forms of sugar, often listed under different names such as glucose syrup, sugar, honey, or other sweeteners. You'll also see refined grains, vegetable oils, flavorings, and emulsifiers. Now look at the nutrition panel. Per bar, these products typically contain a significant amount of added sugars, very little protein and low fiber relative to calories. That combination is critical. Protein and fiber are what help a snack actually do its job, keeping a child satisfied and supporting steady energy between meals. When sugar dominates instead, the snack behaves more like a small dessert. From a physiological standpoint, this leads to the same pattern we've already seen: a quick rise in blood sugar, followed by a drop. This is why many parents notice that muesli bars don't keep their child full for long. Hunger returns quickly. So does the request for another snack. Another important detail is how these bars are positioned. Because they're marketed as healthy kids' foods, they're often eaten frequently, sometimes every school day. That repeated exposure reinforces a preference for sweetness and trains the body to expect quick energy rather than sustained nourishment. There's also the issue of ultra-processing. Snack bars like this are engineered for shelf life, texture, and taste consistency. That requires processing steps far beyond what's used for whole foods. Nutrition research consistently shows that diets high in ultra-processed foods are linked to poorer appetite regulation, especially in children whose metabolic systems are still developing. Again, this isn't about blaming parents. These products look responsible. They're sold that way. But when we step back and look at how they're built, sugar-heavy, low in protein, and highly processed, their role in a child's diet becomes much clearer. That's why snack bars like Uncle Toby's Chewy Muesli bars belong on the list of healthy kids' foods Australian parents must avoid as everyday lunchbox staples. Not because they should never be eaten, but because when a snack fails to provide real satiety, it quietly disrupts appetite and energy throughout the day. And as we move on to the next item, the concern becomes even harder to ignore because the food looks like a full meal. Before we continue, there's one more layer parents rarely think about: how a child's sense of taste is shaped. Children aren't born craving sugar. Their preferences are learned. The foods children eat regularly train their palate, especially during the early years when taste perception is still developing. When sweet flavors appear repeatedly throughout the day, even in foods advertised as healthy, the brain starts to recalibrate what normal sweetness feels like. Over time, naturally, sweet foods stop tasting sweet enough. Fruit doesn't feel satisfying. Plain yogurt tastes boring. Whole foods feel bland. Nutrition science refers to this as sweetness threshold adaptation, the point at which the brain requires more sweetness to experience the same level of pleasure. This adaptation happens quietly. Parents don't see it in one meal. They see it in behavior. Children start rejecting foods they used to eat. They prefer flavored versions. They ask for snacks, even when they've eaten recently. This isn't stubbornness, it's neurobiology. Repeated exposure to sweetened, ultra-processed foods strengthens reward pathways in the brain. Those pathways become less responsive to subtle flavors. And here's the critical part. Once the palate is trained towards sweetness, it doesn't just affect snacks. It affects everything else the child eats. Meals become harder. Vegetables are refused. Parents feel stuck negotiating every bite. This is why health organizations emphasize limiting repeated exposure to sweetened foods during childhood, even those marketed as healthy, not because sweetness is forbidden, but because frequency shapes preference. And that brings us to the next item. Because this product doesn't just contain sugar, It actively trains a child's palate to expect it. Let's move on to number 2. Number 2 is one of the most misunderstood kids' foods in Australia: fruit juice. Fruit juice has a powerful health image. It's associated with vitamins, fruit, and natural goodness. So when parents choose products like Just Juice 100% fruit juice, clearly labeled as no added sugar and made from real fruit, it feels like a safe and even responsible choice. After all, it's fruit, just in liquid form. But when we slow down and look at the nutrition panel and how the body processes juice, the reality changes. What the label actually shows. The ingredient list is simple: fruit juice, sometimes reconstituted from concentrate, no artificial colors, no preservatives, no added sugar, and that's exactly why parents trust it. But now, look at the nutrition panel. A single small juice box can contain a very high amount of naturally occurring sugars, almost no fiber and calories delivered entirely in liquid form. That combination is critical. When fruit is juiced, its fiber, the part that slows sugar absorption, is removed. What remains is a concentrated source of free sugars. From a physiological perspective, the body responds to fruit juice very similarly to how it responds to a sugary drink. Blood sugar rises quickly, insulin is released, and because there's no fiber or chewing involved, satiety signals remain weak. This is why juice doesn't satisfy hunger, even though it contains calories. Parents often experience this without realizing what's happening. A child drinks a juice box, feels fine for a short time, then asks for food again. Not because they need more nutrition, but because liquid sugar doesn't switch off appetite properly. Another important point is frequency. Because juice is seen as healthy, it's often given daily, sometimes multiple times a day. Breakfast, lunchbox, after sport. That repeated exposure trains the body to associate hydration with sweetness and makes plain water less appealing over time. Health organizations around the world consistently make a clear distinction between whole fruit and fruit juice, especially for children. Whole fruit supports satiety. Juice bypasses it. This doesn't mean juice is toxic or forbidden, but it does mean it behaves very differently than most parents expect. That's why fruit juice like Just Juice belongs on the list of healthy kids' foods Australian parents must avoid as an everyday drink. Not because fruit is bad, and not because parents are making careless choices, but because removing fiber and delivering sugar in liquid form fundamentally changes how the body responds, especially in children. And now we arrive at the final item on this list, the one most parents never question at all. Before we get to the final item, there's one reason why some foods escape scrutiny completely. Some foods don't get questioned because they look healthy. Others don't get questioned because they're familiar. They've always been there. They're part of school routines, part of lunchboxes, part of childhood memories. And that familiarity creates trust, even when the food itself has changed dramatically over time. Modern food science shows that many products marketed to children today are not the same foods parents grew up with, even if the name and packaging look identical. Processing methods have evolved. Sugar content has increased. Texture has been engineered. Shelf life has been prioritized. But perception hasn't kept up. Parents often assume, if this has always been normal, it must be fine. This is what psychologists and nutrition researchers refer to as normalization bias, when repeated exposure makes something feel safe, even if evidence suggests otherwise. In children, this matters even more. Foods that are consumed daily without question shape. Taste, preferences, hunger signals, emotional attachment to food, expectations around meals. And once a food reaches this level of normalization, it becomes invisible. Parents stop reading the label. They stop noticing frequency. They stop seeing the cumulative effect. Not because they don't care, but because the food no longer feels like a decision. And that's why the final item on this list is so important. Because it's one of the most normalized foods in childhood. It looks harmless. It's rarely questioned. Yet, from a nutritional and physiological perspective, it plays a far bigger role than most parents realize. Let's move on to number 1. Number 1 is the food almost no parent ever questions: white bread. White bread is everywhere in Australian households. Toast in the morning, sandwiches for school, something quick between meals, products like Tip Top. The one white are often marketed as a better white bread, promoted with claims around fiber, energy, and essential nutrients. To many parents, that sounds like the best of both worlds, something familiar, affordable, and supposedly improved. But once we look closely at the ingredient list and the nutrition panel, this is where everything we've discussed comes together. What the label actually shows. The primary ingredient is refined wheat flour, not whole grain, but flour that has had most of its natural fiber and structure removed. You'll also see added vegetable oils, emulsifiers, and dough conditioners, added vitamins and minerals. Now look at how this bread behaves nutritionally. Despite being marketed as a healthier option, white bread like this is very low in intact fiber, breaks down rapidly into glucose, and provides minimal satiety relative to calories. From a physiological perspective, this means white bread acts more like a sugar than a whole food. When a child eats white bread, blood sugar rises quickly. Insulin follows, and because the fiber structure is missing, there's very little to slow that process down. This is why white bread-based meals often fail to keep children full, even when portion sizes seem reasonable. Parents often notice it without knowing why. A sandwich in the morning. Hunger returns soon after. Another snack is needed, energy fluctuates, and because white bread feels like a meal, parents rarely connect it to the same issues they associate with sugary snacks. There's also the issue of normalization. White bread isn't seen as a treat. It isn't even seen as processed. It's just food. But nutritionally, it's one of the most refined carbohydrate sources in a child's diet, and often the most frequent. Even when vitamins and fiber are added back in, the original food structure is gone. And once that structure is gone, the body responds differently. Health and nutrition research consistently shows that replacing refined grains with minimally processed, fiber-rich alternatives supports better appetite regulation, more stable energy, and improved metabolic health over time. This doesn't mean parents need to panic, and it doesn't mean white bread should never be eaten. But when a food appears multiple times every day, quietly shaping hunger, energy, and taste preferences, it deserves to be questioned. That's why white bread, marketed as healthy for kids, like Tip Top the One White, earns the #1 spot on this list of healthy kids' foods Australian parents must rethink. Not because it looks dangerous, but because it looks normal. And sometimes the most normal foods are the ones doing the most unnoticed work in a child's body. At this point, parents don't need fear. They need awareness. Because once you understand how food structure, sugar exposure, processing, and frequency interact, labels stop being confusing, and choices become clearer. And that's the real goal. If there's one thing to take away from this video, it's this. Most parents aren't making bad choices. They're making choices based on incomplete information. Every product we talked about today is marketed as healthy. Every one of them looks normal in an Australian household. And that's exactly why they're so powerful. The issue isn't one food, it's not one snack, and it's not one decision. It's frequency, processing, and how food behaves in a child's body, not how it's advertised. Once you understand that, labels become less confusing. Hunger patterns start to make sense, and food stops being a constant battle. This isn't about perfection. It's about awareness. Small changes made consistently shape a child's appetite, energy, and relationship with food over time. And the most important thing parents can do isn't eliminate everything on this list. It's start questioning what feels normal. Because once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. If this video helped you see kids' food differently, let us know in the comments. Tell us, which of these foods surprised you the most? And if you're a parent trying to make better choices without fear or confusion, make sure you subscribe to Aussie Food Insider. We break down everyday foods, read the labels for you, and explain what really matters, so you can decide what's right for your family. Because your child's health isn't about trends, it's about understanding.